Letitia James' unprecedented civil case against Trump has no basis in law or evidence, and instead finds its basis in impermissible, selective, and vindictive prosecution motivated by sex, gender, and viewpoint discrimination. Based on the clear and convincing video evidence available, I do not believe James's civil suit against Trump can hold up on appeal. It also appears that the trial judge and others within the New York legal system are temporarily supporting James's targeting of Trump in the hopes that it will interfere with the 2024 presidential election. These election interference efforts appear to be having the opposite of their intended effect. After the election, I believe James's targeting of Trump will eventually result in severe legal penalties for her, as she is scapegoated by her former supporters in an attempt to reestablish the credibility of the New York legal system that she tarnished with her political lawfare.
What is the latest with President Trump's case?
So we're winning. And I've always tell people, this is the long game. People love to say, look, we're going to go over there and Tish James is going to take the keys to Trump Tower. It didn't happen. Why? Because the appellate division read our papers, saw that there are reasons for a stay. They stayed it, they dropped it, they said, we're not taking assets, everything is frozen. Attacked him so badly that now you've taken a billionaire and made him sympathetic. That now we've got people from the left, the middles, they're coming to our side and saying, whoa, this is just too much.
Yeah.
They're going to do this to me.
All right, Frank, the politics of this. Folks in the Biden campaign are already starting to refer to Donald Trump as broke Don, which is interesting. And then there is the possibility that the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, would start seizing assets, maybe even buildings. How do you think that would play?
I want you to remember this moment, and don't forget it. If the New York Attorney General starts to take his homes away, starts to seize his assets, it's all going to be on camera. Pundits are going to sit there and scream about this. This man cannot be elected. You're going to create the greatest victimhood of 2024, and you're going to elect Donald Trump.
While the appellate division hasn't had an opportunity to look at the injustices, look at the decision-making that was so flawed, and frankly, the motivation on this case was flawed. She was motivated to bring this case before she was even in office. That's what she ran on, Miss James. So that in itself, selective prosecution, happens to be illegal. It shouldn't happen.
Did you guys file any motions against Letitia James for all the videos and all the rhetoric of, I'm going to go after Trump? How is that not a conflict of interest?
She was giving the directives. She was given the directives, much like Merrick Garland or any of them, right?
Yeah.
But did we argue selective prosecution? 100 times. Did we argue that she prosecuted President Trump to get into office, said it before, that it was improper, that she was unethical, all those things? 100 times. Was it covered?
No.
The due process provisions of the 5th and 14th Amendments limit when state prosecutors like James or federal prosecutors like Jack Smith can use their positions to deprive Trump or anyone else of life, liberty, or property. In a court filing, Special Prosecutor Jack Smith acknowledged that the U.S. Constitution's due process protections prohibit selective or vindictive prosecutions. Prosecutorial discretion is subject to certain constitutional constraints. One such constraint, imposed by the equal protection component of the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment, is the prohibition against selective prosecution. The decision whether to prosecute may not be based on unjustifiable standards such as race, religion, or other arbitrary classification. Another constraint grounded in the Due Process Clause is the prohibition against vindictive prosecution, which prohibits a charging decision or other prosecutorial action that is motivated by a desire to punish the defendant for doing something that the law plainly allowed him to do. In his filing, Smith set forth what constitutes selective or vindictive prosecution, and it appears obvious that Letitia James' case meets these legal standards. To sustain a claim of selective prosecution, a defendant must demonstrate that the federal prosecutorial policy had a discriminatory effect and that it was motivated by a discriminatory purpose. To make out a claim of vindictive prosecution, a defendant must demonstrate that the prosecutor acted with genuine animus toward the defendant, and the defendant would not have been prosecuted but for that animus.
The President of the United States has complained that I'm engaging in some sort of political witch hunt, that I've got some personal vendetta against him, that I campaigned against him. That is not true. I've not politicized the office. America is an uncharted territory. We are angrier and more deeply divided than we've ever been at any point in our history since the Civil War. And at the eye of the storm is Donald Trump, ripping families apart, threatening women's most basic rights. I'm running for Attorney General because I will never be afraid to challenge this illegitimate president. I believe that this president is incompetent. I believe that this president is ill-equipped to serve in the highest office of this land. And I believe that he is an embarrassment to all that we stand for. He should be charged with obstructing justice. I believe that the president of these United States can be indicted for criminal offenses. And we would join with law enforcement and other attorneys general across this nation in removing this president from office. In addition to that, the Office of Attorney General will continue to follow the money because we believe that he's engaged in a pattern and practice of money laundering the money from foreign governments here in New York State, and particularly related to his real estate holdings. It's important that everyone understand that the days of Donald Trump are coming to an end.
Although she had no victim, no star witness, no precedent, no evidence of fraud, no financial loss, and no evidence of harm, James was able to obtain a judgment against Trump using a judge trial where there was no jury. According to the New York Times, the $355 million penalty that a New York judge ordered Donald J. Trump to pay in his civil fraud trial might seem steep in a case with no victim calling for redress and no star witness pointing the finger at Mr. Trump. But a little-known 70-year-old state law made the punishment possible. In other fraud cases, authorities must persuade a judge or jury that someone was in fact defrauded. But 6312 required Ms. James only to show that conduct was deceptive or created an atmosphere conducive to fraud. Past cases suggest that the word fraud itself is effectively a synonym for dishonest conduct, the Attorney General argued in her lawsuit. Even before she filed her lawsuit against the Trumps in 2022, Ms. James used 6312 as a cudgel to aid her investigation. The law grants the Attorney General's office something akin to prosecutorial investigative power. In most civil cases, a person or entity planning to sue cannot collect documents or conduct interviews until after the lawsuit is filed. But 6312 allows the Attorney General to do a substantive investigation before deciding whether to sue, settle, or abandon a case. In the case against Mr. Trump, the investigation proceeded for nearly 3 years before a lawsuit was filed. Yet the victims, the bankers who lent to Mr. Trump, testified that they were thrilled to have him as a client. And while a parade of witnesses echoed Ms. James' claims that the former president's annual financial statements were works of fiction, none offered evidence showing that Mr. Trump explicitly intended to fool the banks. That might seem unusual, but under 6312, such evidence was not necessary to find fraud. The law did not require the Attorney General to show that Mr. Trump had intended to defraud anyone or that his actions resulted in financial loss. This law packs a wallop, said Stephen M. Cohen, a former federal prosecutor and top official in the Attorney General's office, noting that it did not require the Attorney General to show that anyone had been harmed.
And that explains all of the litigation that we've been involved in. We have a federal government which unfortunately has been engaged in retrenchment, a federal government which is basically closed. And so all of these lawsuits basically are defending the rights of immigrants, the rights of women, the disabled, the rights of individuals, their health care, the environment, and the list goes on and on and on. And if we, again, are to continue the progress that we have made in this nation, if we are to believe in the simple concepts of equality for all and justice for all, then you've got to fight back and you've got to stand up and you have to use the law both as a sword and as a shield. For Attorney General, because I will never be afraid to challenge this illegitimate president when our fundamental rights are at stake. From the Muslim ban, to efforts to deport immigrants, to denying transgender students the ability to choose whatever bathroom they want, rolling back regulations to protect our planet, colluding with foreign powers, putting profits over people, dividing us in ways we haven't seen in generations, corruption in Albany, environmental hazards in Buffalo, and a criminal justice system, unfortunately, which has criminalized too many black and brown people.
Stand up to an administration which is too male, too pale, and too stale. Too male, too pale, and too stale. Too male, too pale, and too stale. And we will not go away silently.
At NBC.
Do you think that Donald Trump should sue New York Attorney General Letitia James, and on what grounds?
I think she should. I saw an interesting little comment of hers I'd not seen before the other day. She said when she was running for Attorney General that she wants to fight an administration that's too male, too pale, and too stale. Now, you can talk about stale ideas, that's fine, but too male and too pale, that constitutes basically sex and race discrimination. So I think what President Trump ought to do is sue her on the basis of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Her office gets federal money, in fact, $311 million approximately for various subsidies for law enforcement activity. So the federal money is flowing into her office, and if she is engaged in that kind of sexual and racial discrimination and that kind of language, I think she's wide open to exposure on the 64 Civil Rights Act. Donald J. Trump should sue Letitia James on the basis of civil rights.
Were Letitia James one of my clients, I would advise her to review Federal Criminal Statute, Title 18, Section 241, before speaking further about targeting Trump or other U.S. citizens based on their race, sex, or political beliefs. Sun Tzu taught that one should catch a snake with the hand of their enemy. I would not be surprised in the slightest if the white man smiling awkwardly along as Letitia James talks about targeting white men were among the first to have her disbarred or prosecuted when she is no longer useful for attacking his political enemy, Donald Trump.
If they take his stuff, he's going to say that this is proof that the federal government and the establishment and the swamp in Washington and all the politicians across the country and the attorneys generals and all of this, that this is a conspiracy to deny him the presidency.
About how we have White House logs that came out while I was on trial. I'm sitting in the back room and I find out that there were White House logs that Tish James visited the White House.
Yeah.
Before and after the complaint was filed.
Before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York, the federal appeals court that sits in New York, there will be oral arguments in the case of Donald J. Trump and Donald J. Trump Jr. versus the Committee on Financial Services. This is the president trying to block Democrats in the House from getting his financial records. But you know what? Whatever happens with all of those federal cases and his fights with Congress, President Trump has a whole nother thing on his hands when it comes to a totally different adversary and inquisitor, the New York State Attorney General. In March, New York Attorney General Letitia James subpoenaed Deutsche Bank for the Trump Organization's financial records, including those related to some of the schemes that Michael Cohen described in his testimony. Joining us now is New York State Attorney General Letitia James. I know that summarizes only a tiny piece of what you and your office are doing right now.
17 cases since I took office 8 months ago, one every 2 weeks.
Really?
Yes.
Tell me about the financial piece of this first. It has been interesting to me to watch the president fight tooth and nail. He hired a whole new raft of lawyers that are only trying to keep his taxes and financial information secret. And he's got a bear of a fight over that, both in his taxes and his financial documents with multiple committees in Congress. But he also seems to have a real fight with you on that. Can you tell us about the progress of that?
And you have to use the law both as a sword and as a shield. Getting to your question. So there are a number of investigations going on in our office as a result of the testimony of Michael Cohen.
On the financial issues in particular, one of the things that we can watch in those federal court fights that are happening between the president and various congressional committees, his legal strategy has stopped those inquiries or at least slowed them down for now. In terms of the way that he has fought you on these matters, do you feel that you have been stopped or that you have been diverted from anything that you're pursuing because of his work?
By no means. The Trust Act was an act that was passed by the New York State Legislature, which basically says that the 3 committees in the United States Congress can ask for the president's tax records in the state of New York, his state taxes. And so we're in litigation right now because the president individually and personally filed a lawsuit against me, the Ways and Means Committee of Congress, as well as New York State Taxation and Finance, basically blocking his taxes. And as you know, Rachel, every president has offered up their taxes, their state and their federal taxes, but not this president. Why shouldn't the law apply to him? Why shouldn't he be held accountable? Why shouldn't he provide transparency to the millions of individuals who would like to see his taxes?
Let me ask.
Because Donald Trump, like all Americans, has a right to privacy guaranteed by the Fourth Amendment. According to the Fourth Amendment, Trump has the right to be secure in his person, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, no matter what Letitia James may want to see.
He's going to go up in the polls just like he went up every single time they indicted him. The indictment, let's not talk about whether it's justified or not, but it will prove the things that he's saying on the campaign trail, and he will go up, and it may just elect him president. Do not forget that. And I say this to the Attorney General right now. If you play politics on this, this is what the secretaries of state did in Colorado and what they did in, I believe, is Maine. His numbers went up in both states. I don't understand. I'm almost speechless in how pathetic the opposition to Trump has been and how completely misguided. And this is a perfect example.